Good evening, everyone. My name is Inakshi Sopti, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Asia Society India Center. I'm delighted to see members, patrons, and friends from across the world join us this evening. I hope all of you and your families are safe and well and have taken the first dose of the vaccine, if not both. As known to most of you, the Asia Society is a leading educational organization dedicated to building awareness about policy, business, education, and arts from across Asia on a global stage. Inaugurated in 2006 by Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, the India Center has hosted over 800 events, establishing itself as an important forum for the discussion of regional and global affairs. Our initiatives include policy roundtables, CEO forums, public lectures, leadership programs, cultural summits, film screenings, and our signature Asia Arts Game Changer Awards, bringing together art collectors, artists, gallerists, and dignitaries from the art world, celebrating and honoring Asian artists. Please do follow our website and social media handles to know more about the awards and other programs from across our 13 global centers. In challenging times, the competencies of governments and political leadership are tested. There's no established or successful model to deal with a global pandemic. However, the past year has demonstrated that effective deployment of resources, swift disaster management measures, transparent public communication, and citizen-focused governance has held some countries in better stead than others while managing their COVID-19 response. Data and reports show that while national responses to the pandemic in G7 countries might have been delayed, Asian countries like Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, Sri Lanka, and Hong Kong were swift in undertaking active precautionary actions. An important lesson is that in an increasingly interdependent world, a challenge of this magnitude cannot be solved without global solidarity and togetherness. Since the onset of the pandemic, international organizations have been key drivers of information distribution and equitable distribution of medical supplies. Keeping in mind these learnings, what are the hallmarks of a progressive governance system? Does political leadership today prioritize rhetoric over the fundamental duties of governance? Do the answers to successful governance lie in Asia? What is the role and importance of international and intergovernmental organizations in confronting crucial challenges like public health, economic growth, and climate change? We have the honor of hosting a truly distinguished panel to discuss these questions this evening. Ambassador Kishore Mehboobani is a former Singaporean diplomat and a distinguished fellow at the Asia Research Institute, National University of Singapore. He served 2 stints as Singapore's ambassador to the UN and has also held the position of permanent secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Ambassador Syed Akbaruddin served as the permanent representative of India to the United Nations. In a diplomatic career spanning more than 3 decades, he represented India's interests in important capacities, promoting strong ties across the globe. Professor Elaine Kamak is a senior fellow in the Governance Studies program, as well as the director of the Center for Effective Public Management at the Brookings Institution. She's an expert on American electoral politics and government innovation and reform in the United States, OECD, and developing countries. Our moderator this evening is Haslinda Amin, Bloomberg's chief international correspondent for Southeast Asia and host and executive producer of talk show High Flyers, which is the longest running program on Bloomberg TV. As an anchor, Amin has been at the heart of market-moving news and stories that have driven the region's transformation. A bit of housekeeping before we proceed. All those who are joining us on Zoom, please leave your questions in the Q&A box and feel free to share your comments on the chat box. Thank you once again for joining us for what promises to be a truly meaningful conversation. And with that, Haslinda, over to you.
Actually, thank you so much for that and for framing the discussion tonight. I mean, the world is hardly recognizable from 20, 30 years ago. Not only is everything shaped by technological change, but the pandemic of the past year has tested governments, forcing them to review policies as they face what some people deem as the biggest test in generations. A health crisis, bringing with it an economic plunge, social as well as political disruption. So we're not in a good spot. One key takeaway from the pandemic is that in times of uncertainty, in times of crisis, leaders need to make quick decisions which are also human-centric, at times bold, even radical. Kishore, let's start with you. What's your own take on leadership in economies that have done well, the countries that Inokshi elaborated earlier?
Well, one thing I learned, I'm the old man in this group, okay? I've been in public service for 50 years now, is that it's always a mistake to rush into judgment. We are still fighting COVID-19, okay? So many countries are still shut down. And I'd be very dangerous to say these are the long-term lessons. But nonetheless, having said that, it's very clear that it's actually, and this is actually quite shocking, that if you look at one indicator of competence in managing COVID-19, it's simply deaths per million of population. And traditionally, the developed countries, the G7 countries, would do well, and the OECD countries would do well, and the third world countries would do badly. That would be the normal thing, the result of a major crisis like this. But what we have seen in COVID-19 is the exact opposite. Among the most incompetent countries in the world, and if you judge it by deaths per million, 1,500 to 2,000, US, UK, France, Belgium, right? It's amazing. And if you want to, and look at the East Asian countries, deaths of 50 or below per million, Japan, South Korea, China, Vietnam, Singapore, and Taiwan, and so on and so forth. So clearly, COVID-19 has shown that competence has shifted to East Asia in a significant way as part of what I call the broader shift of power to Asia. And so if you want to ask yourself, what are the leading sort of indicators of the change that COVID-19 is demonstrating? It is actually demonstrating very clearly that there has been a shift of competence. But of course, this doesn't mean, by the way, let me emphasize that we don't want the Western countries to do well or the rest of the world to do well. We want the rest of the world to do well. We want the West to do well. But the West has got to learn, just as the East succeeded by learning from the West has got to now come and learn from the East. And that will be a wonderful two-way dialogue of competence that will help the world a lot.
Syed, Kishore talks about competence. What exactly have Asia-Pacific nations done right? Is it all about what? Reinvention, collaboration in decision-making? What is it that these nations have done right?
Thank you very much first for intellectually connecting us in a phase when we're all socially distanced. Just like Ambassador Mahbubani said, that when you look from the windshield to the rear view mirror, things look more distant than they actually are. So I think that the impacts of the pandemic remain with us and this will perhaps be the case in the near future. The one thing that the pandemic has brought home to us is a key principle that no one is safe unless metric. Perhaps all of us have failed because today we are far away from that situation of ensuring that everyone is safe. So it may be premature to highlight stakes, etc. But if I have to say one thing, because this is a period of a year plus, it would be that those societies who have used science as the basis and technology as an aid to implementing policies seem to have done better in terms of controlling the number of deaths that Ambassador Mehboobani said. And that means, and this need not be, as was said, that countries who were otherwise technologically very savvy, but using technology in a very simple way and scaling it to the needs of the population seems to be a factor which has helped in minimizing the havoc that the pandemic has caused. So by those standards, there are clearly some who have done better, some who have used more technology, some of the leaders who have fallen back on science as aid, some others who haven't. And perhaps many of the Asian societies have done that much better than what we would usually feel that the West would do in terms of using knowledge-based policies and using technical and technological aids, and in this case, digital aids, to try and reach out and get a feedback loop from the population, along with a soft touch of people-to-people connect. So I think those would be the two things that perhaps have been done better.
Elaine, the US, on the other hand, has pretty much muddled through in some point to issues like political rhetoric that has chipped away public trust over the years. In your book, Why Presidents Fall and How They Can Succeed Again, you talked about how American presidents today spend too much time talking, not enough time governing. Did you see that this time around?
Oh my God, yes. I mean, you know, it was very clear that we had a very unfortunate situation when this pandemic hit, which is the pandemic hit at the same time that America had the least experienced president in the history of the Republic. Donald Trump came into office with no public sector experience, and it showed time and time again the awfulness of his leadership simply is unprecedented. And this is not a partisan statement. I mean, you know, I can name 10 Republican leaders who would have done a better job. Donald Trump had no idea of the levers of government. I remember him stumbling through a press conference on the Defense Production Act. Now, you know, most people don't know about that, but somebody who's president of the United States should know what that is. That is a key piece of legislation. It enables American industry to go into overdrive and produce anything, whether it's PPP or vaccines or anything. He didn't know what it was. It was very clear. I've been a college professor for many years, and we have a sense for when the student is, you know, sort of making up things as they go along, and that's what Donald Trump was doing. So we had a very unfortunate situation in having the least experienced president in a crisis. And it also showed how even presidents with slightly more experience, they spend a lot of time on talking, and they don't spend a lot of time making the machinery of government work. And this was Trump's huge failing. He didn't know the levers he had. He didn't know how to use them. And we had a much, much worse experience than I think we would have otherwise. The contrast, of course, is Biden, who's maybe the most experienced president we've had, certainly in modern times. I mean, 38 years of public service is a lot, and that's more than previous modern American presidents. And he has a profound sense of how to make that work. The first thing he did was use the Defense Production Act to jack up all the production of vaccines, which we're now seeing, and the country's got a lot of vaccines now. It's a sort of night and day situation, but it does go to two things that I think matter globally. One is experienced leadership, but two is a professional bureaucracy, because it's the experienced leader who needs to then make the professional bureaucracy work and offer up solutions and services to the citizens.
The thing is, Elaine, in times of COVID, in times of crisis, leaders do have to talk to, even convince the people about priorities, about policies that must be made. For the US, do you think there's been a lack of communication, a lot of missteps? I mean, this is a country that can't get its people to even wear the masks.
No, that's exactly right. But that comes up against something that's uniquely American, right? Which is that we don't like being told by the government to do anything. All right, so that's not particularly surprising. Frankly, Donald Trump adding to that faction was a disaster. But the fact of the matter is that Americans wouldn't have worn masks anyway. I mean, we're just not going to do that sort of thing. I mean, I wear a mask, most people do. But the fact of the matter is that when it comes to the sorts of things that many countries in Southeast Asia were able to do, okay, the strict controls on the population, the things that are needed in pandemic, Trump or no Trump, that was always going to be a problem in the United States, because the United States, Americans are very, very, very individualistic and don't like being told what to do. There could have been better ways to do it. And I certainly think that Biden is trying to do that. But, this was always going to be a problem.
Your take on that, Kishore?
Well, I mean, I agree with Elaine that Americans are very individualistic and would like to have a greater amount of individual freedom. But I would say at the same time, there are also some structural forces at play here. And I would mention two. One is that it was Ronald Reagan who said, government is not the solution.
It's
government is the problem. And so what that resulted in, unfortunately, after 30, 40 years, is that there's been a demoralization, delegitimization, defunding of government institutions, and even very, very good institutions, by the way, like FDA, CDC became demoralized. And the CDC, sadly, as we all know, did a very bad job this time around, because when you demoralize a government institution, it performs badly. So I think that's one structural change that needs to take place. And here I would say we should adopt the wisdom of this great Indian thinker, Amartya Sen, who said for countries to succeed, they need the invisible hand of free markets and the visible hand of good governance. So that's one structural change I think the United States needs to make that would help the United States. I mean, we want the United States to succeed. We don't want the United States to fail. A strong United States is good for the world. I want to emphasize that. But the second structural point here is that, I was ambassador to the UN in 1998 when we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a beautiful document, a wonderful document. It's transformed the world. But a former German Chancellor, Helmut Schmidt, proposed in 1998 that we adopt a universal declaration. We have a universal declaration of human rights. Let's have a universal declaration of human responsibilities to match. So rights must go with responsibilities. And unfortunately, even though this was proposed by a leading Western statesman, Helmut Schmidt, it was the Western countries that suppressed the Universal Declaration of Human Responsibilities. And if I would say one reason why East Asian countries have done well is because the notion of responsibility to society is very deeply ingrained in a sort of a culture and values of East Asian society. So the reason why people wear masks in East Asia is not just to protect themselves. They feel that they should protect people around them. Mm-hmm. So they feel a sense of responsibility. I mean, you're wearing a mask, not so much as to protect yourself, but to protect all your neighbors and your friends and your family and so on and so forth. So I would say, let's look at the deeper structural issues that we have to deal with. And I certainly agree with Elaine that Donald Trump is a very large part of the problem, but we also have to deal with the structural issues in these areas.
Yeah, can I just add one thing, because I think Ambassador Mahbubani, I'm sorry, I butcher your name.
Kishore.
I think that Kishore has raised what is so interesting about the COVID crisis, which is we have a huge international experiment going on, which is all these different countries coping with the same thing with different variables going into it. One of the variables that is not related to structure other than, historically, is that the Western nations are old. The United States and especially Western Europe, they have an average age that is much, much older than India or any of the Asian nations in Southeast Asia. And this is a virus that hits old people. So the death rate may have a lot more to do with age of a nation than it does with any sort of structural questions. To show you this, the contrast is the Spanish flu back in 1918, which was also a global pandemic. In that flu hit people in the prime of life. It hit people 20 to 40 years old. The elderly didn't tend to die from the Spanish flu as much as the younger people did, and children did. And they think that maybe that's because the elderly generation had been exposed to a similar virus in their youth. So you do have this factor of age that in Italy, it's a very old country. The United States is a relatively old company. Germany, France, England, they're old. Add on one more thing to the United States, which is obesity. We have a pandemic of obesity. All you have to do is look around the United States, any shopping center you'd like to go into. And it is becoming clear that obesity itself is a high risk factor in COVID for reasons that they don't quite understand. So I think there are two factors of the Western world, their advanced age and obesity, that are also contributing to the differences we see between countries.
The one thing that's come through over the past year is the lack of trust in governments. Syed, what's your take on how leaders, countries can recalibrate governance models to make sure that they focus on the citizens and gain back that trust?
Okay, so it's true that the pandemic has put all governance systems under stress, both at the national level as well as at the international level. Now, there is no magic wand by which leaders can come out of this easily, especially in countries which are very diverse, pluralistic in nature, and have a history of being a population which is, as was just told by Elaine, very individualistic. That said, there are some things that can be attended to. A, transparency in governance. B, better public communication. C, to build on what you have. And in his view, there are some intrinsic basis on which society seem to build on. Leaders, therefore, have to take that into account when they act and when they communicate publicly. For example, wearing masks in East Asia actually builds on a tradition which is not new. When the SARS virus was there, East Asia was already sensitized to the needs of their population wearing masks. If leaders have to take actions, they have to build on those bricks which are available. In some societies, for example, India, there are populations living in the 21st century. Some live in the 20th, and some even prior to that. So you need to be able to communicate in tones that are acceptable and amenable to these diverse populations. That's one area that the leaders have to focus. For some, it may not appear palatable that the explanations are being used with local folklore, but that perhaps suits some populations, and it's best to use that as you communicate. So that's one: transparency, better use of bureaucracy, greater communication, willingness to use, again, as I said, scientific tools. Let me give you an example in India. While the pandemic is raging and everybody seems to be focused on that, there are some untold secret success stories. For example, 400 million people were receiving direct benefit transfers to their bank accounts. I mean, just see the number, 400 million. This was not for the pandemic that these bank accounts were set up. These were set up as tools for financial inclusion, but were used for the pandemic. Similarly, 800 million people were being provided rations at subsidized prices, again, using digital identification.
Right.
Now, these numbers are staggering. So you'll have to see some of those advantages which are not easily known, but are playing a role in comparison with what happened in the past. I was just told about the Spanish flu. Now, if you see the numbers of deaths in India during that a century ago and today, I mean, it was in the millions. Today, we are grateful that while the pandemic is causing havoc, the number of deaths is still, of course, every death is a difficult for anyone, but still it is much more in terms of numbers manageable.
Kishore, what's your take? Will leadership be redefined in these new circumstances?
Well, first of all, by the way, I want to very, very strongly support a point that Ambassador Syed Akbaruddin made. He made a very important point, which I hope you have taken note of, which is that 400 million people, that's larger than the population of the United States of America, got direct transfers, and 800 million people got subsidized rations, okay? And of course, a lot of this is due to new technology. And of course, there's, I think Ambassador Syed didn't mention this, but there's this other, your identification with your thumbprint and all that. That's made a huge difference. So I emphasize that point because today we have the capacity to reach the bottom 10%, the bottom 20% of any society effectively. And this will apply, by the way, to the United States, to India, to China, to everybody else. So that's a very important point. So now on your point on leadership, I would certainly agree, Haslinda, that leadership is very, very critical in crisis like this. And I want to mention to Elaine actually that you know, you mentioned the Western societies being old. I think two Western societies that actually have done as well as East Asian societies, Australia and New Zealand. And I think Australia has also got an obesity problem, by the way. so I haven't quite figured out, Elaine, why is it that Australia and New Zealand have done much, much better than any other Western societies? But I suspect proximity to East Asia and being affected by the values of East Asia may be a challenge. But Haslinda, going back to your question, I think leadership makes a huge difference. And that's why I think we should think very hard. I mean, I know this is a very difficult issue to solve. How do we make sure, to go back to what Elaine said, that the world never again has an inexperienced president like Donald Trump again? He did enough havoc for 4 years. How do we disqualify presidents like Donald Trump?
I want to link this to a question that's being sent through by one of our participants, and Mudit Jain says that, do you think the pandemic will lead to outsourcing of inefficient governments to better ones? Linked to the question I asked earlier, can the monopoly of bad governments be broken like it has in manufacturing and services? I guess the question really is, Kishore, whether governments will learn from this. Inefficient governments will put to rest and learn from the experience of the pandemic.
I think that it will take some time, but I think eventually governments will definitely learn from their lessons of the pandemic. And by the way, I hope, we haven't discussed it so far, Haslinda, that the biggest lesson that COVID-19 is teaching us is that the state of humanity has changed. In the past, when we live in 193 countries in the world, which we do, it was as though we were living in 193 separate boats. Now, COVID-19 has taught us that the 7.5, 7.7, 7.8 billion, whatever figure you use, billion people in the world no longer live in 193 separate boats. They live in 193 separate cabins on the same boat. And I think that's the biggest lesson from COVID-19. It doesn't matter where you are in the world, COVID-19 will get to you. So if we are all on the same boat, if a fire takes place in one cabin, by the way, the stupidest thing to do is to start arguing about who started the fire, who started COVID-19. That's stupid. First, you put out the fire. And so the big lesson from COVID-19, which I hope all leaders take on board, is that We are all on the same boat, and we have to cooperate, and we have to get along. So institutions like G20, World Health Organization, the United Nations become far more important. And from my point of view, if you ask me for the one really big lesson of COVID-19, it's very simple. We are on the same boat. You can't get away from it.
Can I
Elaine, we see the finger pointing.
Yeah, that's a very good analogy, the same boat. We had an interesting experience in the United States. First of all, when COVID first hit, and it was clear that President Trump was not going to give very much aid to the states, the governors of the 50 states began to communicate laterally without the federal government, because it was clear under Trump that the federal government was fairly useless, with one exception, which was the development of the vaccine. And I think, Haslinda, that you mentioned at the outcome, governments learning from each other. And we saw that with the states in the United States, first as a result of no presidential leadership, then as a result of the fact that logistically, the last mile delivery of those vaccines had to be local. I mean, it couldn't be a federal function. So I do think that we have seen governmental learning, and I'm hoping that within the United States, and then I'm hoping that internationally, we'll have more of the conversations like Kishore and I have started here, which is, okay, what happened, right? How much of this pandemic was due to the characteristics of the pandemic? How much of this had to do with governmental and leadership competence? How much of this was cultural and not really related to either one? And I think we will learn a great deal about coping with future crises if we engage in that kind of learning, both internally in big countries like India and like the United States, and globally.
Speaking of learning, Kishore, ASEAN came up with the ASEAN Response Fund. Has there been enough solidarity, a big enough regional coordinated response that maybe perhaps the others can learn from?
Well, I mean, I'm going to give away a big secret, Haslinda. The strength of ASEAN lies in its weakness. And even though they set up the ASEAN Response Fund, frankly, not very much happened on that front. Let's be honest about it. But at the same time, you saw, by the way, that the European Union, of course, is a much more advanced organization, tougher, much more tightly run organization than the ASEAN is. And to watch the mad scramble for vaccines among the European states was actually quite obscene.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole point of having the European Union was to say, hey, let's try to cooperate, right? And the good thing about ASEAN is that there was much less of a zero-sum game among the ASEAN countries. And the critical thing, by the way, I want to emphasize this point, when the world literally shut down, March, April last year, borders were closed, trade began to stop. What could have really squeezed ASEAN if ASEAN had closed its borders to trade, especially, by the way, food and essential supplies. And the best thing that ASEAN did was that it kept these food supplies going, trade going. And that's why overall, as you can see, the ASEAN region, relatively speaking, has done quite well in this COVID-19 crisis. So ASEAN is not an organization that tries for moonshots. What it does is that it prevents you from falling into hell. That's what ASEAN does. And I think ASEAN has provided a wonderful safety net for, I would say, the 700 million people of Southeast Asia. And that's why, on overall, by the way, if you look look at third world regions around the world, I think none can claim to have done as well as ASEAN has done.
How about India, Syed? I mean, India is grappling with a fresh resurgence. To what extent has India's public, private and communities collaborated? What could have been done better? How could have they done better?
So that perhaps we are in the worst phase of the pandemic as far as India is concerned during the last few days. It came in late, but we are in a much greater difficult situation than we were ever during the last year and a half. What could have been done better? Well, it's interesting that when India started the pandemic, we were not even self-sufficient in PPE, in many of the requirements of ventilators, etc. So over here, there has been a focus on health and public health as a core area of public policy like never before. So that helped, but perhaps what happened was it also bred a feeling of confidence or perhaps even overconfidence. And by December, most Indians were thinking that the COVID is over. We now are back to near normal. The numbers have gone down. And so most of them were back to business as usual. In fact, if you look at the vaccine exports of any country in the world, the US has not exported any vaccine. European Union has put in restrictions of vaccine. The Chinese, who don't even have a COVID problem as the rest of the world right now, are not exporting in the numbers that they could perhaps do. India in January and February, or even up to March, exported as much as about 60 million vaccine doses. They began with the neighbor. We don't have, unlike the ASEAN, we don't have a regional organization which can provide that safety network. The SAARC is a much, much more weakened version of ASEAN. They tried to integrate it, it did not work, but then India itself exported vaccine to about 80 countries. Now, when the numbers started increasing in India, there was such a backlash for the government. So all the things that you are telling should be done were tried out in December, January, February in India, being global, ensuring that the safety of everyone is important. We need to look at the whole universe as a single ship. And today, the government is under immense criticism that you did not provide for the population, which is such a large population, which is by and large a population with significant numbers under the poverty line, etc. So, I mean, there is no pattern that, well, yes, everybody should have gone the way that the European Union has gone, or India should have gone. Each has to find a way. India's way was to be much more open in the beginning and now become restrictive. The others have gone the other way of being much more tight in the beginning and perhaps much more open now.
We can't talk about the pandemic without talking about China. Syed brought China up. How much leadership has China shown, given that the pandemic started in China? Kishore.
Well, as you know, whenever you raise the word China, a lot of alarm bells ring, and people will talk about all the terrible things that China has done. But I think, again, when I began, my very first comment was that we will know over time what were the long-lasting effects of COVID-19. We will also know over time what were the right things that China did right or did wrong on COVID-19. So there are different things. One is, of course, what they did at the beginning. Did they give the world sufficient notice? And here I would say, read the Lancet magazine. The editor of Lancet, Richard Horton, has actually documented that the Chinese did provide the data reasonably early. And in any case, when China shut down the country 2 days before Chinese New Year, when they prevented 800 million Chinese from traveling, that was a very powerful signal that COVID-19 was a very serious thing. And so perhaps I would say the most important contributions that China has made is, number one, they have 1.4 billion people. By containing COVID-19 among 1.4 billion people, they have actually made a global public good in many ways. They have saved a lot of lives in that way. And therefore, after the initial outbreak, they ensured that China was never again a major source of the problem. But I would say on the negative side, I think China has done a very bad job at communicating what it is doing. And as you know, China has been subject to a lot of criticisms. And the fact that the head of the WHO, Tedros, as you know, has come out and criticized China. I think China should listen very carefully when someone like the head of the WHO criticizes China. And China, I believe, should go through some degree of self-reflection of what it did right and what it did wrong on COVID-19.
Elaine, from an American perspective?
Well, I think, you know, if you were to ask Donald Trump and Donald Trump followers, he would say the whole thing is China. Most Americans don't believe that. But they are suspicious of China, as they are, I think, correctly suspicious of any totalitarian state. You don't know when the Chinese government is telling the truth, and you don't know when they're not. There's suspicion about the Chinese vaccine, which they've been distributing, and you know, whether it really meets international standards and is as good as other vaccines. So there's a great deal of suspicion in the United States about China, and China doesn't help that suspicion when it, you know, goes back and forth on its statements about what it's doing in the world. So there's a lot of suspicion about China. And, you know, I take Kishore's point about maybe China got a bad rap early on and didn't get enough credit for closing down. But the very nature of that government makes Americans and makes the American government very suspicious of what's going on there.
Syed.
Just an additional point, and it's not about COVID and China, but Chinese behavior globally during the COVID. And I'm not talking about the epidemic itself, but during an epidemic, raising tensions with your neighbor on dominance. And I meant the India-China border issue. The pandemic is not the time to address these issues. But clearly, it seems that for some reason, China may have calculated that this is the time to assert ourselves beyond our borders. So we could list several issues, but coming from India, I would want to restrict myself to their assertiveness on our borders. This is not the behavior that you expect from a country which is poised to want to lead the world, to set values and norms, and to provide opportunities or behavioral patterns that others should follow. So whether it is on the borders in Himalayas, or issues relating to Hong Kong, or issues relating to the South China Sea, we can see a series of issues that during the pandemic, they suddenly have started to bubble up. And that's not a happy situation for a global great power to be in.
I'd like at this stage to take some questions from the participants, and there are many. Do you feel that COVID-19 will propel multilateralism, plurilateralism, or bilateralism internally? Will the pandemic necessitate the emergence of a technocratic barbarian state? Kishore, I think this is yours.
Well, I think two questions. One is on multilateralism. One is I've never heard this term before, technocratic barbarian state. It's a new term. On multilateralism, certainly, I mean, if we claim that human beings are the most intelligent species on planet Earth, then, as you know, the stupidest thing you could do, if we are all 7.8 billion on the same boat, And if one cabin catches fire, we say, oh, who started the fire? Who started the fire? And you argue before you put out the fire. That's stupidity. So clearly the lesson of COVID-19, in fact, also the lesson of global warming is that all the 193 cabins on the same global boat have to work together. I think that as you know, that was a big message in my book, The Great Convergence. And that was a message I learned as the Singapore's ambassador to the UN also, that essentially we are all on the same boat. So multilateralism, I believe, is going to become a sunrise industry. And here, unfortunately, the dirty secret I'm going to expose on multilateralism is that it was the Western countries who, even though they created all the global multilateral institutions, have been weakening the multilateral institutions. And if you don't believe me, read a book by Professor Kelly Lee on the World Health Organization. And she points out in the 1970s, about 60 to 70% of the budget of the World Health Organization came from compulsory access contributions. The Western countries pushed it down to 18% of the World Health Organization budget. And that was a big strategic mistake, because if you want a strong World Health Organization to prevent future pandemics, you cannot have a strong organization if 82% of the budget of the organization comes from voluntary contributions, which can go up and down every year. You must have strong compulsory access contributions. So the Western countries have made a major strategic mistake in weakening global multilateral organizations. And since the West only makes up 12% of the world's population, it's actually in the interest of the West to now switch their policies from weakening global multilateral organizations to strengthening global multilateral organizations. And I think that I hope is one big lesson from COVID-19. If that happens, I think the world will be a better place. And let's strengthen the UN and all these organizations, because at the end of the day, they're all Western creations. They're not created by Asia. The UN, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, you name it, IAEA, these are all Western creations. Let's strengthen these Western originated institutions. Second point on technocratic barbarian state. I think, this is where, frankly, the question is, if you want to understand a country like China with 1.4 billion people, with a 4,000 to 5,000 year history, and you believe you can understand it by insulting it, by making nasty comments about it, then you are in trouble. Because at the end of the day, and this, I'm going to stick my neck out, okay? The largest economy in the world, whether it's 10 years or 20 years from now, will not be the United States. It will be China. And believe me, the world is going to change fundamentally when China becomes the number one economy in the world. I'm not saying this out of either approval or disapproval. I'm just a dispassionate, hard-headed, cool, rational, geopolitical analyst trying to tell you what the world is going to be like in 2030, 2040, and get ready for it.
Cool,
now,
rational, Kishore, yes.
That China is going to respond on the basis, believe it or not, on the basis of its 4,000 years of traditions. So when you use insulting terms, you don't understand what is going to happen vis-a-vis the China. I mean, Ambassador Syed Akbaruddin mentioned Hong Kong. In my book, Has China Won, I tell the story of how Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru received a letter from President John F. Kennedy and Prime Minister Harold Macmillan saying, don't invade Goa. Goa belongs to Portugal. And what did Prime Minister Nehru did? He did the right thing in 1961. He invaded Goa. Goa belongs to India. So when colonial territories go back to the country they come from, don't say bring back the Western colonial rule. That's not going to happen, right? So let's be clear, right? You got to overcome the divisions of what the Western colonial era. And to keep on saying that Hong Kong is not part of China is pure wishful thinking. Hong Kong is part of China, just like Goa is part of India.
I want to go back to multilateral institutions. Syed, you say that if multilateral governance systems are to reflect the world of the 21st century, it is necessary to develop an equitable system that reflects 21st century values, not the values of the Cold War. Talk to us about what concrete changes are needed.
So the 21st, the present multilateral order obviously is an outcome of 20th century concerns, because it was after the Second World War that it was all set up and established. That said, many of the challenges which are global in nature are challenges of modernity, if you want to say that, whether it's health security or climate security, whether it is cyber security or data management and governance. Now, all these are not areas that any of the multilateral bodies were set up or established to address. Yes, they have incrementally tried to adjust to them. But one of the problems of these challenges is that they often lack a direct human agent or perpetrator. Climate change, for example. You could, in general, indicate what is the source of climate change, but today you can't identify X, Y, Z as the perpetrator of that. Similarly, human security or pandemic. Now, the present multilateral system is obviously not geared for this. So if we are to look at them addressing 21st century challenges, then like our own societies, we are looking at building back better. We need to build back better for multilateral governance too. And that means a host today has a population of nearly 5 billion, having perhaps less say than Europe, which has a population of less than 1 billion. If you talk of human-centric approach, then humans everywhere count. So you need to reform, reinvigorate, revitalize, and there could be many pathways to that. But to think that we will go back to the pre-COVID normal is wishful thinking. You will have to change. And for that, having worked at the UN as a international civil servant and as a diplomat, I don't see that coming out from that system. You will have to have plurilateral efforts that will then bring it to the UN system, because the catalysis has to come from somewhere else, because the systems as they are now are not amenable to that sort of fundamental change or effervescence. That said, one last point, responding to Ambassador Mahbubani, because I can't let him go with that analogy of Goa and Hong Kong, because all I'm saying is pandemic the time to do these things? That's my only point. There are plenty of, a civilization which thinks in thousands of years, hundreds of years, needs to be understanding of its global role also. Pandemic is not the time to do this. I just use that as one example, but my main example, as I've said, was the Himalayan border. Let's not get into confrontations when you have to focus on something else. And that's my simple point. I don't think there's a comparison between Goa and Hong Kong at all. Thank you.
There's time and place. Elaine, this question from Rajashankar Malay. What behavioral insights can be used for effective governance of the pandemic? How can leaders drive the change in behavior of people and bureaucracy?
Well, that's a very good question, and thank you. I have recently written about this and about the necessity for governments to learn to cope with crises better than they have coped with crises. And I have basically 4 suggestions. One is that governments routinely engage in scenario planning, both internally and of course internationally. That this is because that helps leaders think about governing in crises. The second is that I encourage governments to think about surge capacity. In other words, how when you suddenly need more doctors, more nurses, more people to put vaccines in arms, how do you build that surge capacity for emergency situations? Third is looking at dual use technology. That's a familiar concept in the American military where we start buying off the shelf technology, but it is not a familiar concept in medicine where we need to start looking at drugs that we have currently around that can be used for a multiplicity of problems. And finally, of course, you just need experienced leadership to create the bureaucratic entities that have this kind of ability to react to crises. Climate change means that we are in for a century of dramatic crises, unfortunately. We couldn't get our arms around it from the beginning. The United States is a big problem there. Climate change means that we will have crises after crises, and we need to get government to adapt to be a much more flexible and quick acting entity than the bureaucracies of the 20th century.
I'm just going to take one more question because we're fast running out of time. And I think this question goes to both the ambassadors. How and in what manner does the Quad promote the idea of multilateralism? This is from Dr. S.K. Pachuri. His question is, how and in what manner does the Quad promote the idea of multilateralism? Syed, do you want to take this first? And then Kishore, you'll wrap it up.
Right. So the Quad is an effort to try and work beyond the normal multilateral forums ways. So let me give you just one example focused on the pandemic, how the Quad can work perhaps or contribute in very innovative ways. At the first Quad summit meeting, it was agreed that India would set up a vaccine plant of Johnson & Johnson, for one which would be provided because Indian capital is not available for that sort of an effort. Funding for that would be provided by Japan and by the US from private or even semi-government sources. Now, these are innovative ways of trying to catalyze responses rather than trying to point blame. So my point is that if you want catalytic responses, which are not likely to come from multilateral organizations, you need ginger groups. And the Quad is one such ginger group, which is trying to promote in difficult times the habit of working together. And I've given you the example of COVID and pandemic responses. The fourth part of providing these doses to small Pacific islands and parts of the region of the Indo-Pacific region. So it's a sort of a division of responsibility to address a big global challenge.
Kishore?
I'll make 2 points. First is, of course, that I actually wrote a very long article for the Foreign Policy magazine on which four-letter word will determine the future of Asia. And one four-letter word is Quad, and for the other four-letter word is Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And frankly, at the end of the day, the 10 plus 5 countries, 10 ASEAN countries, plus 5 other countries who have joined the RCEP, China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. I think that's the agreement that will drive the future of East Asia. So if you want to back the right horse for the future, you back RCEP, not the Quad. And indeed, as you know, there's an open door for India to join the RCEP, and all of the ASEAN countries very much hope that India will join the RCEP eventually. We understand India's hesitation, but India would love to have India in RCEP. The Quad, however, and I agree with Ambassador Syed Akbaruddin that the Quad is doing a wonderful job in promoting the manufacturing and distribution of vaccine. I would say the Quad is doing a wonderful job there. But I would say the Quad suffers from what I call an image problem. And the image problem is that it is seen by most people in the world as an anti-China alliance. It may be fair, it may be unfair, but that's the perception of the Quad. And that's why I think, I believe that in international relations, perceptions matter a great deal. And what's interesting is that lots of other countries could have also joined the Quad, but they haven't done so. But it's certainly, I think that what the Quad is doing in promoting vaccine is, I think, a wonderful thing, and I hope the Quad succeeds in that.
And on that note, I'd like to wrap up today's discussion. Leadership and governance, such a mammoth topic, and our distinguished speakers today, all giants in their fields. I'd like to thank Ambassador Kishore Mahbubani, Ambassador Syed Akbaruddin, and Professor Elaine Kamarck for their insights, their views, very candid, all straight talkers. And of course, would like to thank the Asia Society for hosting us tonight. Good night, everybody, and thank you for joining us.